Hello and welcome to Constructed Awareness, a free 1-hour introductory course. My name is Tyler Orr. I'm a counselor and creator of Constructed Awareness, which is a model of psychotherapy that's designed to help clients build resources and process trauma using awareness as the mechanism of change. So as the name implies, this course is designed to be free and 1 hour and give some basic information about constructed awareness, kind of hit the high spots, and hopefully help pique your interest about what constructed awareness is and maybe begin your journey of exploring and learning more about constructed awareness. So the course is broken into 8 different sections and has a total runtime of 61 minutes. This course comes with 1 free CE. And I'll tell you at the end of the video how to get that. It's super easy. Let's just go ahead and dive in by talking about the 3 foundational principles of CA. All right, so let's talk about the first principle of CA, which actually is the most important one. It's the most fundamental and the one that CA therapists return to the most. Without this, nothing else happens with CA. So the first principle says that bringing awareness to your experience changes your experience. Now, we see examples of this all the time. The obvious one is how we all tend to behave when we're alone versus when someone's with us. That simple act of observing has the power to bring change. We also see this with how little kids behave differently if they're being watched versus if they're not. That simple act of witnessing has the power to bring about change. So with constructed awareness, that is what we lean on. We don't put energy into trying to change the client's experience. We put our energy into helping them deepen their awareness of their experience and allowing that awareness itself to bring about the change that they've been looking for. I first realized this when I was a really young therapist, like still in counseling school. And in counseling school, they taught us the traditional way of doing therapy that's more like cognitive, behavioral based. And so I did everything I was taught. I identified the problem and the symptoms. I created a treatment plan, did everything that I knew to help the client succeed. But I just saw so many times, just time after time, clients would return to the second session in worse shape than they were previously. And it's because they still had the original problem. Nothing had changed about that. But now they're kind of being double whammied with thoughts about like, why am I not good enough? Why am I not strong enough to stick to the plan or to overcome the symptom or whatever it was? And so I saw that time and time again, really just, I guess, one too many times. And then I decided this isn't the approach for me. There's got to be a different way to bring about change therapeutically. So I began to explore other options. And along the way, discovered that awareness itself has the power to bring change. And one of the more important things that I wanted to mention in this brief introductory video is a concept called nonviolence, which I came across from a therapist named Ron Kurtz. Now, Ron Kurtz is the developer of Hakomi method, and he wrote a book called Body-Centered Psychotherapy. And he's a big influence on me through this period where I was developing this new way of doing therapy. And in his book, he talks about violence and nonviolence in therapy. And to understand nonviolence, I think it's important to talk about violence. So he said in his book that when someone simply assumes they know what's best for others, you have violence. Now, this was a hard pill for me to swallow at first. That seemed too extreme, especially the word violence. But as I continued to read, everything just began to click for me. It made total sense. So basically, if you decide you know what's best for someone and you begin to impose your will onto them, then that's an oppressive, violent act. But the kicker, the thing that really got me in his book was he said that it's still violent, even if what you're assuming is best for the client is that they should feel better, right? And that really struck me because like that's what we're supposed to do as therapists, right? That's what I thought. We're supposed to help clients feel better or make them feel better, which you can almost hear the violence in that term. So this was an important addition to what would become constructed awareness, because with CA, we don't try to change the client's experience at all. We don't interfere or intervene. We don't impose our values or our ideas. Instead, we just help clients bring awareness to their experience, and we trust that awareness itself will be the catalyst, the mechanism that brings about the change. Kurtz also said in his book, you don't have to know the answers for your patients. All you have to do is turn them inside themselves because they know the answers. I have come to believe this 100%. As a CA therapist, I don't effort as hard as I did before. I don't try to make things happen. I just rely on the client's ability to change and grow and heal from within themselves. And that can happen as long as I stay out of the way and just help them deepen their awareness of themselves. And I'm convinced at this point that the only reason a bad habit repeats is a lack of awareness of everything that happens in that pattern, in that habit. It feels almost like clients are like at point A where they're okay, and then they're at point B where they're not okay. And it's like, how did I get here? Well, there's a lot that happens between point A and point B. There's all kinds of links in the chain. And if a person becomes aware of all of those individual links, each link can become a launching point. It can become a place for them to do something different simply because they're aware of something that was previously unconscious. Like if this is happening from point A to point B on autopilot, it's just going to repeat, right? And so what we're trying to do is help the client understand every little thing that's happening within that pattern. Like for me, I remember a simple example that, my son and I went through a period of time when he was younger when we had a lot of tension with each other. And one time he said something kind of smart aleck to me, and I felt my eyebrow lift in this particular way. And it was like, that's what snapped me out of that habitual state where I, like the automatic pilot, where I would kind of lash out back at him. So that simple little movement in my eyebrow was enough to kind of break that spell of that pattern and do something different. Without the awareness, there wouldn't be an opportunity for change to arise. So that really is the foundation of CA, that we put all our energy into helping the client understand themselves better, to deepen their awareness of themselves, and we trust that awareness itself will bring about the change that they're looking for. So what are we bringing awareness to? Well, that's the focus of the next section and the next principle. The second principle of CA says that the human experience is made of three building blocks: thoughts, sensations, and external senses. So basically, we all have a mental building block, a sensation building block, and external building block. Now, this idea is influenced by the theory of constructed emotion, which was developed by Lisa Feldman Barrett. I wanted to put up this slide to show you the book that she wrote called How Emotions Are Made. I think it's an excellent read if CA is a topic of interest to you. Barrett challenges the classical view of emotion that sort of views emotions as things that live inside of you. And we see this when movies like Inside Out, where there's little characters that represent each emotion that sort of spring forth whenever it's most appropriate. Well, the early theorists of the classical view actually talk about emotions as entities that live inside of us. So Barrett comes along with the theory of constructed emotion and begins to challenge this and states that emotions aren't these fixed, innate things that are inside of us ready just to come forth. Instead, emotions are constructed in the moment by smaller elemental pieces. And this is what CA aligns with. The thing about it, though, was as much as I've read of Barrett from her book and the papers that she's written and contributed to, I've never seen her talk about what the actual elements are that construct our emotional experiences. So that's where CA comes along and I think takes the theory a little bit further and maybe simplifies it, where we view the elements that construct emotions as your mental building block, sensation building block, and external building block. So basically every moment of your life, every experience you've ever had, not just emotion, because Barrett talks about that it's not just emotions that are constructed, it's your entire reality. So everything you've ever experienced is a combination of these three building blocks. And that's pretty wild to think we can boil your whole reality down just to that. Now, the theory of constructed emotion also talks about that emotions are real, but only conceptually. They're not actually real in a real way. They're not an entity that you can find in reality. And so an emotion really is just a word that describes the collection of the things that make it up. And our minds do this all the time. We just don't pay attention to it very often. So a good example is it's easier to say I want spaghetti for dinner than to say I want boiled noodles, ground beef, tomato sauce, garlic, onions. If you had to explain everything that made up something like spaghetti, if you had to do that with everything, it'd be a really difficult existence. So luckily, what our brains do is they take something that's made of a bunch of parts and they put one word to it. Another great example, probably my favorite example, is a storm. So within a storm, there's all kinds of things you can notice with your senses. You can see the lightning. You can feel the wind and the rain. You can hear the thunder. But we're a storm. If we were in the middle of a storm and I said, hey, go put your finger on storm, you'd realize really quickly, well, there is no storm. Storm is just a word that we use to describe the collection of all the things that make a storm. And the same is true for an emotion. And I think this is where people get mixed up or confused. They have a hard time understanding and working with emotions because they don't know what they're working with. So let's take anxiety, for example. Let's say something happens in the external environment that triggers an anxiety response. So what does it trigger? It triggers thoughts and sensations. So you can notice the thing that's happening externally. You can notice the thoughts that are coming to mind, what you see and hear in your mind. You can notice the sensations you feel in your body. But where is anxiety? There is no anxiety. Anxiety is just a word that describes the collection of those building blocks. So with CA, we don't work with emotions per se. We work with the parts that construct it. Because when someone says they feel anxious, that sort of kills the curiosity. It's like, it's anxiety. Like, we don't need to look any deeper. But with CA, we do look deeper. So if someone says they feel anxious, it's like, what tells you that? So we break the emotion down into those three parts and begin to bring awareness-based resources to those. Okay, so that's it for this one. The next section gets into principle 3, which teaches us how to take the first two principles and apply it into a therapeutic context. Okay, let's look at the third principle of CA, which states that most people naturally orient their awareness more strongly to one of the three building blocks. So what we mean by this is people tend to prefer one building block over the other two in different situations. And that preference is what we refer to as orientation. So basically, if someone is relying most on their mental building block, in that moment, they are mentally oriented. If someone's relying on their sensation building block, they're sensation oriented. If they're relying on their external building block, then they're externally oriented. Some key terms to consider as we move forward. What do we mean by orientation? So orientation, according to the CA theory, is defined as the fluid organization and reciprocal interplay of our mental, bodily, and external experiences. So simply put, it's the arrangement of the client's building blocks. We use a term sometimes called dominance, which refers to the building block that the client relies on over the other two in different situations. So whichever building block they're relying on in that moment is their dominant building block. So take, for example, this client. Imagine that this illustration here is a client's nervous system. So imagine a client is out with their friends, they're hanging out, they're having a great time, they feel connected, their awareness is naturally shifted more outside of themselves as they engage with other people. So in this moment, we can see that the client is externally oriented because the external building block is dominant in this moment. But let's say something happens as they're hanging out, or maybe later on, a problem comes up that needs to be solved. So the mind comes to the forefront. The mental building block becomes dominant, and the external kind of goes into second place. So in this instance, we would say that the client is mentally oriented. But let's say something else happens that causes the client to experience a lot of physical sensation or begin to express emotion on a deeper level. So in this instance, the client's sensation building block takes the top spot, and they express a sensation orientation. So we found over the years of working with CA that different orientations tend to express specific personality traits, character traits, attachment styles, and we'll get into that a little bit deeper here in a bit when we get into the CA typology. But right away, we begin to see that clients who express a mental orientation tend to be more logical, rational, analytical. When a client expresses a sensation orientation, they tend to be more sensitive, emotional, or just kind of deep feeling. And when a client expresses an external orientation, they tend to be more considerate, agreeable, and helpful. So when we're talking about these orientations, it's important to mention that we're not trying to type someone. Like I said, we'll get into a little bit later about the CA typology, and we're going to emphasize that again when we get there. But we're not trying to like type or identify someone as mentally oriented, sensation oriented, or externally oriented. No one is one orientation. Our building blocks are always shifting and flowing. And so sometimes a client might express one orientation and later might express a different orientation. In fact, I would say that that's true for pretty much everybody. But sometimes a client can express what we call an in-tune orientation. And that's whenever their building blocks are fluid, right? They can notice what's going on in the environment inside themselves, and their orientation can adapt to that in a really like efficient, useful way. But sometimes clients can express what we call a dissonant orientation, which can either be fixed or fluctuating. We'll talk about that in just a second. But typically clients come to therapy because of dissonant orientation patterns. They don't come because like a bad thing happened or an uncomfortable thing happened one time. They come because it happens over and over again. So this is useful in therapy because it helps us as CA therapists understand what the client's orientation patterns are, which help us understand like why they're coming to therapy in the first place. And it helps us learn to tailor make resources specifically for each client. So let's look at what we mean real quick about in tune or dissonant. Here's a great illustration to show that. So we have in tune, which is in the middle, and remember that's fluid. And on the edges we have dissonant. On the left we have fixed, on the right fluctuating. So what do we mean by this? So if a client is experiencing a fixed orientation, it's like, how do we define fixed, first of all? So fixed can be defined as a state of rigidity or immobility, constant, unchanging, and resistant to movement or alteration. So if someone's experiencing a fixed orientation, according to CA, they have an over-reliance on one building block to regulate. So this sort of fixed orientation is like wearing the same outfit to every situation. You know, it's like wearing flip-flops to a wedding because you just can't seem to put on anything else. And I knew a guy once that wore shorts year-round. Like, it gets cold here in Tennessee. They could be, knee-deep in snow, and he would still have shorts on. So that's sort of an example of a fixed style. So next we have fluctuating. So what do we mean by fluctuating? We can define it as a state of variability, instability, or inconsistency. So fluctuating orientation is the inability to rely on one building block to regulate. When someone experiences this type of orientation, there's not really like a home base, right? There's not a consistent way for them to regulate themselves. And it's because the building blocks are constantly changing in ways that don't make sense to them or aren't like appropriate or useful. And so with that comes a lot of like emotional dysregulation. And we could say that's sort of like the person's outfit is just changing without any sort of consistency. And they seem to have no control over how it's changing. And then finally, we have fluid. So a definition for fluid is a state of flexibility and ease of movement. So with a fluid orientation, there's the ability to assess what's happening in the moment, identify which building block is best suited to meet the situation, and utilize that building block appropriately. A fluid orientation is awareness of what outfit is most appropriate in a situation and changing the outfit accordingly. So what happens when somebody's experiencing a fixed orientation? They tend to be overstabilized, overregulated, and what's needed for them is more balance. But over on the right, we have fluctuating. So when someone's experiencing a fluctuating orientation, stability is underdeveloped, regulation is underdeveloped, and they struggle to find balance. So knowing how the client is oriented is super helpful for resource building. When I first attended therapy as a client years ago, I didn't know I was mentally oriented at the time, but my therapist did more cognitive therapy, and it was useful, obviously, right? I'm a therapist now. It was a good experience. But it really didn't teach me much new about myself. It just bolstered up the part of me that I was already good at, my mind. So it's like cognitive therapy really just sort of aligned with the cognitive nature of myself. But it wasn't until I began to learn about like mindfulness and learn to connect with my external environment, and I learned about somatic therapy and learned to begin to feel my body and to be embodied. And I began to move into these underdeveloped parts of myself. That's when things started to really change for me. So what we do with CA typically is, especially if you're working with someone who's has a fixed orientation. So take for me for example, I'm mentally oriented. So my mental is like way up here, my external and sensation are down here. If you're the therapist, you may not need to spend much time with me working on mental resources. Instead, we would focus on the parts that are less developed to bring awareness-based resources to level that up, to bring balance, so that I can connect with all parts of myself more easily, more fluidly, and I can access those parts of myself in ways that I couldn't before because I didn't have access to them. Now, when you're working with someone with a fluctuating orientation, it may be a little bit different, because whereas I tend to be more fixed, I'm overstabilized. Someone who's fluctuating, they struggle to find that regulation. So what we do a lot of times with a fluctuating orientation is kind of practice all the resources to begin to find like some sort of home base, some sort of stability that the client can find a bit of regulation within a building block or two. So what we'll do is connect, we'll build that stability and use that as sort of the place to return to as the client moves into those underdeveloped or less stabilizing parts of their experience. So before we get into a section on resources, I want to talk about the constructed awareness typology, which is the next section. So let's do that, and then we'll move into specifically how to do CA resourcing and take what I just said a little bit further. Okay, now that we've concluded the sections on the three principles, let's take it even further. Let's talk about the CA typology. So if you remember, we have the three building blocks: mental, sensation, and external. Now, the CA typology came about by combining and rearranging those building blocks. And by doing that, I found that there are 6 different combinations, 6 different possible combinations of the building blocks. It creates 2 mental, 2 external, and 2 sensation. So we call these different combinations of building blocks the orientation styles. We have 2 mental orientation styles, 2 external, and 2 sensations. And we call them the letters as you see them. So MES, MSE, EMS, ESM, SME, SEM. And each orientation style, or each combination, has sort of a nickname. And we're going to get into what those are in here in a little bit. It's just a way to help you kind of remember what that style is. So we showed this slide earlier. We have the 3 primary orientations. We can take that further by expanding that out into the 6 orientation styles. So let's take a look at each of the orientation styles and talk a little bit about what they're like, because each style comes with sort of predictable, I guess you could say, character traits, personality traits, attachment styles, learning styles, just like you see with a lot of other typologies, like the Myers-Briggs, the Enneagram, stuff like that. It's like there's different, they have types, we have styles, and I'll talk about that here in a minute. But each style has associated traits that we can sort of expect if we're able to assess and acknowledge that a client is representing a specific style. We use the term style, not type. A type implies a rigid categorization based on predefined or fixed criteria or characteristics. A style refers to a way an individual expresses themselves. So you could think of like hairstyle or style of music. And in this case, what we're referring to is the style have personality traits, behaviors, preferences, learning approaches, and attachment patterns that are typically associated with that style. So basically, a type describes a person, and a style describes the way someone expresses themselves. And that's important for this model because we don't type people with CA. We don't believe that someone is a specific type, that they're fixed in that type. I think research, especially recent research, has shown that there can be harm in that by sort of defining and pigeonholing someone into like a specific descriptive word or type like that. So we don't do that. Instead, we're looking for more like orientation patterns, because that orientation can change if the building blocks change, as we talked about earlier, how they can sort of rearrange themselves. And now someone is in a completely different orientation style, and they'll express themselves differently when they're experiencing that style, not that they're fixed in some rigid categorization. So first we have MES. We call this striving. That's the nickname. Notice that the M is the dominant building block. It's in first place. And then the E and the S, the external and the sensation, are less developed. So this style is very assertive, driven, and decisive. So when in tune, think about this style as like fire. Like when in tune, they can be really warm. They can draw people to them. They're able to get a lot done. They're very accomplished, sort of type A kind of people. They strive. But when dissonant, especially in that fixed dissonance, you'll see this style really like burn too hot and burn people, or they'll burn themselves out. So they overdo it. They become workaholics. And that striving really goes sort of to the extreme. And it can cause them to cross other people's boundaries. It can cause them to do things for people whether they want it or not, right? So it becomes very like forceful and pushy sort of energy. But we also have the MSC, which is thinking. So this is more whereas the MES is more like an active forward moving energy, the MSC is more passive, cautious, slower, stuck moving kind of energy. Also mentally oriented, but you'll see the difference, I think, is the E is in last place. So what happens here is it creates a very internal existence, and the person's naturally kind of cut off from their environment. So they internalize things, and that can cause them to get like stuck inside of themselves. So they can come up with great ideas just like the MES, but the MES, because of that active forward moving energy, will tend to push through and make it happen. They manifest things in the world, whereas the MSE really get stuck inside of themselves and don't follow through with things outside of them out in the world. And that's because of that internal existence that they live. So when they're in tune, they can be really, just deep thinkers. You think of some of the best philosophers, theologians, scientists in the world. They bring so much into the world through this deep thinking. But whenever they're dissonant, it really leads to a lot of like isolation and cut off. It's really difficult for a lot of people to be in a relationship with someone who's a dissonant MSC style or someone who's expressing that. Next, we have SME. So the sensation building block is in first place here, and the mental and external are less developed. So we call this style the feeling style. So these are the deep feelers of the world. And notice it's a really similar arrangement to MSE, which was the deep thinkers. So we're just flipping the S and the M. So it goes from MSE, deep thinking, SME, deep feeling. So this style is empathetic, loyal, but they tend to be really easily overwhelmed. And again, it's because of that like internal experience. So think of like, the literature that's out about like highly sensitive people. This fits this really well. So this style tends to naturally be really sensitive, and they tend to react really strongly to sensations or their thoughts or their external environment. So especially when they're more in that dissonant place, it can really lead to sort of that hypersensitivity, But whenever they're in tune, they have this beautiful, like empathic ability to connect with other people, to connect with themselves, to really be in tune with like what their experience is. And then we have SEM, which we call trusting. So again, it's sensation oriented, that sensation building blocks in first place, but the E and the M have flipped places. So this style we call trusting because they're really innocent, endearing. They're also really like suggestible. So what happens with this style a lot, I think it's because the M is in last place, that mental is in last place. They may not be in touch with their thoughts. And what happens with that is they lose track of like what they want. They tend to not have opinions or thoughts about like what they want, what they feel. And so a lot of times they'll partner up with partners or friends or therapists that are more mentally oriented to almost work as like a surrogate mind, because they're really prone to be like, what do you think I should do? Right? Or I've heard even extreme cases like, what do you think I should feel? Right? And because they just don't really have the mental solid ground, we could say, to really like make those sort of decisions for themselves. So they often partner with people who will make those decisions for them. And we talk a lot about this in the CA trainings, and this is true for like all different orientation styles, but especially this style. We want to be real careful not to approach therapy violently by telling them what they should do. That comes back to Ron Kurtz. Instead, because we're just going to become like another external source that's telling them what to do. Instead, our goal is to help them develop that like mental awareness and clarity so that they know what they're thinking and they can begin to make those decisions for themselves. What do they want? Where do they want boundaries set? How do they know that they want to be with somebody? And they learn to tap into their mind to tell them that. And next we're moving to the external. So we have EMS. This is adapting. E's in first place. M and S are less developed. So this style is naturally extroverted, outgoing, optimistic. Think of like a social butterfly, right? They're just sort of easy breezy. This style always reminds me of like air as an element, right? They just go with the flow. And this is really great when they're in tune. They're, some of the most delightful people. They can adapt to any situation. So what we mean by adapting, they're really good at like reading the environment and adapting themselves to meet that environment, which can be a really great thing. But when it's dissonant, right? Too much of any medicine's poison. When they're dissonant, they can really lose track of like who they are. They can adapt, not with a strong sense of self, but as like a way just to fit in or to regulate themselves by regulating the environment. I always think it's like some people adapt themselves to meet the needs of the environment. Some people adapt the environment to meet their needs. So that's sort of, I always think of like somebody like Chris Farley, a big personality that walks in the room. And when, I've never been in the presence of Chris Farley, but I imagine when he'd walk in the room, the whole vibe of the room would change. The whole energy would change. He had a really powerful gift of like changing the energy in the environment to change the energy within himself, because that's typically what externally oriented people do. They regulate the environment to regulate themselves. But the adapting type oftentimes can regulate themselves to meet the needs of the environment, to fit in. And finally, we have the ESM. So also external, except the S and the M are flipped. It's kind of like what we've talked about before, where the striving style is more active and the thinking was more passive. It's the same sort of thing. It's like the adapting style is more active, outgoing, moving, flowing through the world. The ESM giving is more passive energy. It's more of a kind of stuck energy where they tend to care for other people. They're very generous. They're natural peacemakers. So these are like some of the most wonderful, delightful people in the world. I always think of my grandmother when I think of this. It's like when she was alive, she held the family together. I don't think we saw it at the time. I don't think we understood that, but it's like she carried the weight of the whole family on her shoulders. And you can see, when I say it that way, it's like that kind of energy can cause a stuckness. And you'll see that in therapy with clients when they're dissonant. that they always put the needs of other people first, and that prevents them from actually moving through therapy in a way that's productive or like accomplish their goals, because a lot of times they'll think that's selfish. If I think of myself, then that's a selfish thing. So that guilt comes in and kind of prevents them from moving forward in life or in therapy. So again, this is a similar vibe to the trusting style, except the way that I always explain it is the trusting style is more helpless. The giving style is more helpful. But there's a similar overlap in that the M is in last place. So you'll have a similar thing like, what do you think I should do? How do you think I should feel? They tend to partner with, romantic partners, friends, or therapists that tell them what to do. So I'm always really careful as a mentally oriented therapist not to impose my will of what they should do. Instead, that's where I bring in that curiosity and awareness. And it's like, well, what do you want to do? What tells you that? What do you notice in your mind? What do you notice in your body? Just to help them learn to become more in tune with themselves, because you got that E that's in first place and the sensation and mental are in last. So it's like they live a very external existence. What's the side effect of living your life looking outward? You don't have much practice looking inward. So anyone who demonstrates frequently an external orientation will tend to struggle to know what they want. And so when you're working with an externally oriented client, be really careful that you're not someone that tells them what they should want, because that's not helping them learn anything new, to uncover anything about themselves. It's like, can you really learn about yourself by looking outside of yourself? I don't think so. I think that's impossible. So one thing you'll see too with externally oriented clients is they'll tend to ask people for advice. They tend to listen to a lot of podcasts, read a lot of books, anything they're looking for information to fill that sort of mental gap that they have. So our job as therapists isn't to fill that for them. It's to help them learn to look inside of themselves, to look for the answers. So why do we do this? I think that's a good question. We spend a decent amount of time in all three levels of CA talking about the different orientation styles, because it helps us, I think, number one, build rapport, because the associated character traits and personality styles and the attachment patterns and all the things that are connected to the different styles, they can help you make predictions about clients. So let's say, for example, I have someone who's ESM, a client who commonly demonstrates ESM. They're in front of me and we're talking and I'm able to identify that. I can say things like, I wonder if you've had a history in your life of being attracted to partners and friends who are really opinionated and tend to tell you what to do a lot. And they're like, yeah, how would you know that? It's almost like I come across as psychic because I can make these really accurate predictions. Or I'm working with someone who really seems like they spend a lot of time in a MES, striving formation. And I say, I wonder if you have a history of being attracted to romantic partners with a lot of insecurity or emotional issues. And they're like, how would you know that, right? It's just because I know these patterns. So it helps me know the client really quickly in a broad strokes kind of way. And it really helps to deepen that rapport. And like we were talking about earlier, it also helps to develop resources. So if I'm able to identify that a client spends most of their time MSE, well, I may not want to spend as much time on the mental resources as I would the sensation, and especially the external. So it even makes it more granular. It helps us really know what's most underdeveloped, because we were talking with the orientations. It helps us know what's dominant, and then we've got the two underdeveloped. Knowing the styles really helps you know the hierarchy of the building blocks, to know, okay, which one are they really disconnected from? So if I was working with that client who primarily MSE, I would know that I would probably start first with the external resources to begin to build up the part that's most underdeveloped. Now, there's different ways that CA therapists assess orientation. One way that I wanted to show you now in this training, because it doesn't really involve training, there's an assessment that I developed with some peers called the Constructed Awareness Scale. Now, you can find this on the Constructed Awareness website. If you go to constructedawareness.com, you'll notice right here on the main page, it says click here to take the Constructed Awareness Scale to learn your orientation style. So you click that and it takes you to constructedawarenessScale.com. And here on this intro page, there's instructions. So thank you for taking the Constructed Awareness Scale. The purpose of the CAS is to identify your orientation style or styles. Notice that, because no one is just one style. By exploring how you engage with your thoughts, sensations, and external world. Constructed Awareness teaches that, and we have the principles here. So let's don't get into that too much, but it does say each orientation style is associated with distinct character and personality traits, and your orientation style may shift depending on context, whether you're at work, at home, with your family of origin, etc., offering insights into how your orientation adapts across different areas of life. So please click the button below to begin the quiz. And remember that no one is one orientation style all the time. So feel free to take the CAS with one context in mind. So think about like you're with a loved one. Or you think about like taking it as you are at work. Or taking it as your just like normal day-to-day, most common way of being. Whatever it is, stressful situations, comfortable situations. And doing it that way will help you uncover orientation patterns that show up in different situations. So let's just take the quiz together and I'll show you. It doesn't require any training. You're just answering 1 to 4. So 1 is strongly disagree, 4 is strongly agree, for 12 items. So the first item is emotional. So for me, I would not consider myself very emotional. So I'll go 2 disagree. Logical, yes, strongly agree. Click 4. Next, cooperative. Yeah, I would say I'm not the most cooperative person in the world, but I would agree with that. So I'll go with 3. Rational, yeah, all the way, strongly agree. Deep feeler, not so much. I wouldn't say, I'm going to go with disagree. Helpful, it's, man, I wish there was like a 3.5, but I'm going to go ahead and go 3. I would say agree there. Reasoned? Yep, I would say strongly agree. Emotive? I would say strongly disagree, actually. I'm not a super emotive, emotional person. I don't express emotions outwardly. Considerate? Yeah, I agree with that. Sensitive? No, I was disagree. Analytical? 100%. I'll go 4. Agreeable? Yeah, I'll agree with that. So, and it says show my score. So it comes up with MES, right? And it has the numbers for each category, and it puts them in order from dominant to least dominant. So it says next, select the orientation style below that matches your 3-letter code. For example, if your code is EMS, then click EMS from the options below to learn more. Remember, you can take the quiz with different contexts in mind, and you may find that you identify with qualities from more than one style. Okay, so I'm going to click on MES because that's the score it gave me. And what I just did was this sort of like my normal day-to-day state. You could take this again later. Like I said, like imagining you're at work. Like I took this once imagining that I was like teaching a training. I was like super in the flow and really engaged and just kind of at my best. I actually got EMS, so it's externally oriented. But I've taken this before, imagining being like with family, my family of origin, and came up with MSE, which is actually, I think, more how I was mostly when I was a kid, which is super interesting. So you get different styles for different like contexts or different situations. But see, it shows here all kinds of information about this style. It talks about principal characteristics, communication styles, boundaries, how constructed awareness benefits this style. And you can click up here and go through all the different styles. We have MSE. See, it has the same layout. It tells us all kinds of information about it. Right? And then EMS, same thing. ESM, SME, or SEM. Great. And you can click on the CA logo and it'll take you back to the beginning of the quiz. And you can take it again under a different situation. So I hope this helps. Next, we're going to move on to actually getting into the resourcing, because now we know about the orientation style. It helps us understand like what resources are most useful for the client, because we can focus more on and especially with more of a fixed orientation, it helps us know which building blocks are less developed. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so let's talk about CA resourcing. Now, the thing that makes CA resourcing different than most models of therapy is resourcing is typically focused on things like emotional regulation, coping skills. It's like relaxation strategies. So most of the time, resourcing is focusing on helping the client feel better or doing things or activities to help the client regulate themselves. So I always like to think of it like traditional resourcing is more like regulation focused, whereas CA resourcing is more awareness focused, because all of the activities or everything that we do for resourcing, the exercises, they're all intended to help the client deepen their awareness of their experience. Now, you remember from principle 1, awareness itself is transformative. So we're not trying to change the client's experience. That's what a lot of traditional therapy does. But what we're trying to do is help the client deepen their awareness. So every single thing we do that's resource related or processing related, which we'll talk about in a bit, with CA is intended to help the client deepen their awareness of their experience. And we're trusting that the awareness itself will bring the change that the client's looking for. So the resourcing is focused on the 3 building blocks, where we have mental, sensation, and external building blocks. So in the CA trainings, especially in level 1, because level 1 is really focused on resourcing, levels 2 and 3 are focused more on the processing of trauma. But in level 1, we learn resources that are specific for the mental building block, the sensation building block, and the external building block. I think one that's really worth mentioning here is a technique or an approach, practice called talking with your hands, which is a practice that we use in CA to help clients learn to connect with sensations and to develop a vocabulary for describing those sensations. This kind of came about because in my journey to learn more about my external and sensation building blocks, because if you remember, I'm naturally mentally oriented, I did a lot of things along the way to try to learn to connect somatically, and struggled a lot because a lot of it felt really sort of abstract. And I think that's because a lot of the somatic therapy stuff comes from more Eastern traditions. And it sort of felt like, it's like, do I need to have like a spiritual experience to connect with my body? And I love a good spiritual experience, but I'm also very like practical and scientific in my thinking. So I struggled with that, but something clicked with me when I had this epiphany that what if the sensations I feel in my body are just my sense of touch on the inside of my skin? That, I feel things on the outside of my skin, my sense of touch, and I can feel those same things inside. So it's like, I can feel, I could grab this bottle and I could tell you all kinds of things about what it feels like. You could hand it to me blindfolded. I could tell you its weight, its shape, its temperature, its the texture of its boundary, like on and on and on. I could spend probably 10 or 15 minutes just describing thing after thing. But then if you were to ask me, what do you feel in your body? What do you mean? Right? But I realized that all those same things I can feel inside. I can notice temperature and weight and shape and size. I can notice the boundaries of sensations. So I started to think about connecting with, I began to perceive it that way, connecting with sensation the same way that I would if I was touching something with my hands. And that changed everything for me. And it's like I realized all of a sudden, I have a vocabulary for describing sensation because I know how to describe the way things feel with touch. So that's one thing that we focus on in especially day 2 of the level 1 training, is that talking with your hands practice and helping. It's a way to help clients learn to connect with what they feel in new ways, but also use like really accurate, non-judgmental ways of describing only using words they would use if they were touching something with their hands. So you can see there's like this parallel where it's like what you experience outside, you also experience inside. The same is true for thoughts, because you see and hear things with your eyes and ears. You hear and see things with your mind, right? You see pictures and you hear sounds. You also hear and see those same things in your mind. You can notice colors of things in your environment. You can notice distance. You can notice the size and shape of things visually. You can also notice those same things in your mind. So especially when we're working with thoughts in CA resourcing, we're not working with thoughts like you do in cognitive therapy. We're not doing it in sort of like meta way. We're doing it like a bottom up, not a top down. We're actually practicing looking at and listening to thoughts. Like, what are the words that are coming to mind? What's the tone of that voice? How clear is that voice? How loud is that voice? Like those types of things. And it really helps the client to bring a deeper curiosity and a richer experience to all of the building blocks. Another big part of CA resourcing is once the client is aware of all three building blocks, they're able to connect with all three, we then begin to help them to start connecting or shifting their awareness between the three building blocks. Now, this is a technique, practice that we call tuning. And tuning really is at the heart of CA resourcing and trauma processing. If you get involved in CA trainings, you'll realize that that's really all we do in processing of trauma is we start off by resourcing the clients, helping them learn to connect with each building block. Then we begin practicing shifting the awareness between the three building blocks. So let's say the client is expressing something that happened during their week, and you as the therapist notice that some sort of activation is happening. And maybe you invite the client to notice, like as you say that, like what thoughts are coming to mind. And they say, well, I see my coworker sitting in front of me. And then you ask for details about what they're noticing, visual details, maybe like the color of the shirt that the person's wearing or the color of their hair. Are they more to the left or to the right? And you just connect with that visually. And then after, a minute or so of doing that, you ask them to shift their awareness to what are you feeling in your body as you notice that picture? And then they connect with a sensation and use those talking with your hands prompts to describe maybe the temperature or the weight of the sensation. And then you can tune back to the visual image, or maybe tune back to see if there's any like auditory, like spoken, like the words in the mind. Or you can shift to the environment to ground and connect with the space that the client's in. And once that resourcing is complete, you can then move into the trauma work using the tuning because you know that the client can do it. It's really tricky to think about, like, how do I teach resourcing in a 1-hour video? I can't. But I wanted to give you something that you can begin to use right away. And I think the easiest way to do that is with a resource, it's a handout. We call it the emotion tracker. And it's a way to deconstruct emotions into the three building blocks. So let me pull it up here. Okay, here it is, right? So this will be available in a link in the description of this video, along with the quiz and the evaluation. So let's take a deeper look at it. So the first question is, what emotion are you feeling? So I'll give you an example. The other day I was outside. It was in the evening. We're kind of getting ready to close up the house for the night, and I smelled a skunk pretty strongly, like one was close by. Came back inside. The sun had just went down, and we decided we need to let the dogs out one more time. So I let my dogs out, and as soon as we let them out, they started barking, and I experienced fear. So what emotion are you feeling? I could write fear. And then what thoughts are coming to mind? So you're looking here for, like, what are you seeing or hearing in the mind? We talk about in CA trainings that the mind is like a TV. A TV spits out audio and video. The mind does the same thing. So what are you seeing or hearing? So let's say that I saw a picture. I did see a picture in my mind of the dogs up against the fence barking, and there was a skunk on the other side of the fence with its tail up, getting ready to spray. So that's the visual picture. The auditory part, like the words that were coming to mind, was like, oh my God, there's a skunk, they're going to be sprayed. And next we have, what sensations do you notice in your body? Be careful not to put emotion words here, because remember, the emotion word goes up with what emotion are you feeling. the emotion is broken down into the 3 building blocks. So we're specifically looking for what sensations do you feel in your body. So I felt like tension in my chest and my core, my face felt hot, my jaws clenched. And then this last question is geared toward what's happening in the external environment. So if I was filling this out while the dogs were barking, I could say that I hear the dogs barking, I smell the skunk. If I'm filling this out later and the dogs are inside and everyone's safe, but I'm still feeling upset, I could write, NA, not applicable, or nothing, right? Or sometimes like it's really useful to just notice that the environment is safe. And this is a really great activity for clients to do that, to kind of recognize the safety and the stability of what's going on in their space. Because oftentimes, like how many times have you been a nervous wreck, but you're in a room that's as safe and stable as a space can be, right? And that's because your mind and your body are fueling each other and creating that emotional response. So this exercise is really great sometimes to show there's actually nothing going on in the environment that's stressful. But if they are filling this out while that stressful thing's going on, they can practice writing down like what they're noticing in their environment. So again, this is available in the description. Please download it, give it a shot. Hopefully it'll make a difference in your practice. So let's talk briefly about how we process trauma with CA. Now, this is probably the most challenging part to teach in this video course, because how do I take something that we teach in 2 levels of training, 8 days, 60 hours of training? How do we put that into just a few minutes? I mean, I can't. So I think the purpose of this section is just to briefly introduce the terms so that you know, like, kind of what to look forward to if constructed awareness is piquing your interest. So in level 2, we focus on something called memory reconstruction, which is based on a science called memory reconsolidation, which has found that memories are pliable and are able to be processed and worked with under certain circumstances. So I took from the literature on memory reconsolidation, all the tips and tricks and things that I could pick up, like what makes this effective therapeutically, and designed a structured script for processing memories called memory reconstruction. So really that is the focus of level 2. We're learning how to reconstruct or process traumatic memories using a guided script. Now in level 3, we focus on learning something called responsive processing, which is an unstructured way of processing not just memories, but any sort of issue or activation that the client's experiencing. It's similar to how we talked about in the last section using tuning, but it's a more expanded way of tuning. And so it's like you're just talking with the client, and all of a sudden they notice some sort of activation, like something comes up. Maybe you notice there's like tension in between their brow as they're talking, or maybe they're like looking kind of up and away, like they're looking at the thought that they're talking about. Whatever it is, you notice that, and then you bring awareness to it and you practice tuning. Again, similar to what we were talking about in the last section, but it's longer. So maybe let that go for 15 or 20 minutes until the client is able to process and move through whatever that activation is. Then you continue talking until the next activation arises, and then you bring awareness to it. So it's this real organic, flowy, free-form way of processing trauma, because sometimes, like, if you've done something like EMDR or any sort of process-oriented approach like that, sometimes it does put pressure on the client to say, like, okay, we're going to now in this next session do this processing event. Like, it's, the whole session is the process of memory, and that's hard for some clients. So we've kind of expanded the way of processing trauma into this more fluid, organic kind of way of responding. It's why it's called responsive processing, because you're responding to what is arising in the client's system, and you're processing that in sort of smaller chunks. It's more of an accumulation of processing over time rather than these big, large events like, memory processing like we would do with memory reconstruction. So really at the end, from levels 1, 2, and 3, you get a really cohesive, full model of trauma processing work that starts with resourcing, and then you have a lot of flexibility about how you process that. So that's it. let's just move now to just a quick little closing section and we'll wrap up this course. Thank you so much for reaching the end of the course with me. I really do appreciate it. I've really enjoyed making this, and I just thank you so much for watching it. I wanted to talk to you real quick about how do you get your CE. So if you go to the description of this video, there'll be a link to a Google form where you'll fill out the evaluation and you'll take a quiz that you have to pass. You have to make it 75%. There's 4 questions, so you're allowed to miss one. And when you pass that and if you complete all that and you hit submit, if you pass it, you'll automatically receive a certificate in your email. So you don't have to do anything. That'll just show up, right? Easy peasy. So if you're interested, if this has piqued your interest, please check out constructiveawareness.com. There's so much on there for you to use to continue your CA journey. There's information about trainings. There's blogs, there's published papers. The CA podcast is on there, which is new and I'm excited about. So just continue to explore CA with the resources that are available. Please reach out to me if you have any questions. You can reach me at info@constructiveawareness.com. And I really hope that I get a chance to meet you in person one day. So until then, take care.